Hello and welcome to Who Needs Western Civ, a podcast about liberal arts and classical education. I'm your host, Clay Green, and today I'm extremely excited to be joined by Cornel West. West is one of the nation's foremost public intellectuals, the author of the classics Race Matters and Democracy Matters, as well as many other seminal works. He is a frequent commentator on public events, a committed social and political activist, and a beloved teacher at his many sterling academic appointments. As part of his dedication to American public life, he is running for president in 2024. Cornel, I really can't say enough how much it means to me to have you here. It's a real blessing.
Brother, you blessed me to be in conversation with you, and I appreciate the wonderful time we had just a few weeks ago with Brother Robert George, man.
That was a tremendous pleasure. I'll never forget when I came to pick you up from your hotel. You got out and gave me a big hug and talked to me about Milton, and that made me feel so good.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and Precious Zaytoon too.
That's right. Yeah, your wonderful daughter. Your wonderful daughter.
Yeah, we had a great time, though, man. Definitely.
Well, with your daughter Zaytoon, you got in the car with me, we started talking about German literature and German philosophy, and I was very surprised to hear you had such knowledge and respect for German Romanticism. That's something we share.
Absolutely.
What is it about those authors that pulled you in?
Well, I mean, German Romanticism has a number of streams and strands, but it's one of the highest moments in the history of the modern world, which is to say, is one of the great moments in which the best of the West is manifest, which is the unleashing of conceptions of freedom, conceptions of democracy, conceptions of the dignity and sanctity of everyday people. The great poet of freedom, and Schiller, for example, Beethoven's, my God, the symphonies, Opus 131 and 132. One can go on and on. And it actually, it leads toward the Marx, Nietzsche, and others who have such profound critiques. And many of us may not be persuaded, but there's no doubt that it's tied to the best of the West, which is the Socratic legacy of Athens and the prophetic legacy of Jerusalem. And I treasure those figures. I treasure those moments. And as we were talking in the car, when you think of any great empire or civilization or society and regime, you keep track of the best and you keep track of the worst. And every regime, every civilization, every empire has its ugly crimes, and they tend to come back. But they also have some grand ideals and virtues and values we want to hold on to the best of our ability. So that, Schelling, for me, I think we were talking about his great essay on the essence of humanity and the great essay on freedom of 1809 after the death of his beloved wife. He's facing a level of personal catastrophe that was overwhelming. In fact, he would go silent for almost 30 years after that. So that it's a matter of both keeping contact with the humanity of these figures, but also acknowledging unbelievable courage, talent, genius, determination, honesty, and their critiques of domination, their critiques of lies and crimes.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And you brought up the twin legacies of Athens and Jerusalem, the prophetic legacy, the Socratic legacy. When we're talking about something like the West, it can be unclear if we're really talking about anything at all, or if we're talking about a sort of figment of our imagination or something that doesn't really hold together. Do you think it makes sense to think about the West as something that holds together? Does a term like the West really refer to anything?
Well, it's a wonderful question, because there's always going to be a vastness, a complexity, a heterogeneity, which is to say a whole host of different elements and factors that are difficult to render coherent and consistent. When we're talking about the West these days, we're really talking about the ways in which the early moments of the Europeanization of the world, which begins in 1492 and it ends in 1945, but it's been the most influential period in the history of the species because it has the capacity to bring the species to an end. You know what I mean? So that you have to talk about the Europeanization of the world, that historical moment in which those nations between the Ural Mountains and the Atlantic Oceans began to disproportionately shape the world in their own interests and their own images. And there's been some great moments, some high moments during that period, and been some very ugly ones with indigenous peoples in slavery and working people subjugated, women marginalized, and so forth. And therefore, the conception of the West has to do with how these European nations are conceiving of itself in relation to a conversation that goes back to Plato, Socrates, and goes back to Hebrew scripture and Jesus, and then later on Muhammad. And the great Alfred North Whitehead is right in his classic Adventures of Ideas, where he says, well, the best of that conception of itself connected to Athens and Jerusalem is the promotion of what he called a noble discontent, a critical discontent. Socrates goes to death. Why? Because he's dissatisfied. He has a discontent with the levels of lies and crimes, and he's willing to die. He's condemned to death. Similarly so with Jesus, who's on a cross, perpetuated by the Roman Empire after he runs the money changers out of the temple. A discontent. What does it mean to be critical, to go over against the status quo, to go over against a mainstream and a streamline that does not want to be honest about itself? And I find that to be actually a beautiful, beautiful tradition. I really do. And at that point, it's not a question of what color or even gender. It's the question of what kinds of human beings are being talked about and what kinds of human beings at the level of virtue and virtues such as courage and justice and love and as a Christian faith and hope, what kind of weight and gravitas they actually have. So there's a sense in which when we talk about Western civilization in the abstract, we want to be able to bring it down to the ground. Who was Socrates? What kind of choices did he make? Why was he condemned? Who was Amos? Who was Esther? Who was Jesus? Who was Muhammad? We can go all the way up. Who was Diderot? Who was Martin Luther King Jr.? Who was Fannie Lou Hamer? Who was Edward Said? These are all figures who are part of the intellectual tradition and political traditions we associate with the West. And there's the best and the worst. And that's true no matter what. There's always the best and the worst, though, brother.
So the West is both a legacy of empire and a legacy of the critique of empire.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like fundamental theme in Shakespeare. Shakespeare probably is the greatest poetic figure in the history of the West, the literary tradition, with the exception of Dante. I mean, we can have debates. Of course, you're a Milton man, so I mean, Milton's in on that.
Yeah, if he can get in that conversation, I'll be happy.
Oh, well, Milton is. He's one of the great ones. But what's distinctive, I think, about Shakespeare is that he is so committed to a conception of the art over against empire. And by art, what I mean is this beautiful voice of poetry in which truth tries to be true. To the complexity of the world. Truth tries to be true to the complexity of the heart and the complexity of the soul. And that's always a gargantuan challenge. And Dante is, I think, in many ways, a grand exemplar of that in the history of the West. But that takes us all the way back to Middle Ages and things.
Shakespeare has, like you said, that remarkable quality of almost universal human sympathy, not universal in a dried out, blank kind of condition, but he really has this ability to see the particulars that make up each human experience in this way that, like you said, resists great narratives, resists things like empire, resists color, creed, this kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And the greatest descendant, really, of Shakespeare is my own favorite literary artist, Anton Chekhov.
Yeah.
When he talks about absolute condemnation of no one, absolute embrace
Hmm.
of everyone, compassion across the board, no matter how thuggish or gangsterous, you still
Hmm.
find something positive in their humanity, because
Hmm.
as human beings, we are profoundly wretched, whether we
Hmm.
manifest it or not. And as human beings, we are profoundly wonderful. We
Hmm.
have the potential to be wonderful. And that's really an echo of, Sophocles' great song in Antigone.
Hmm.
The wretchedness of human beings, the wonderfulness of human beings. That's not
Hmm.
even Christian in terms of my own particular
Hmm.
Christian tradition, but magnificent pagans like Sophocles have a depth and a scope of
Hmm.
wisdom, let
Hmm.
alone just outright truth telling,
Hmm.
that behooves us to take seriously, especially in these times of such overwhelming grimness
Hmm.
and dimness, though, man. The
Hmm.
level of despair that's being generated these days, given the historical events that
Hmm.
are running us. We've
Hmm.
got to have something to fall back on so that
Hmm.
catastrophe does not have the last word. We can't deny catastrophe. We can't overlook it, avoid it, but we've got to be able to work through it and not allow it to have the last word.
Hmm. How do we balance the respect for Western civilization without arriving at something that I'm certain you would want to resist, something like triumphalism or chauvinism? How do we have a respect for Western civilization as a civilization and not as civilization? I love I love the great parts of Western civilization as much as you do, and I also feel that there's always the possibility of not being able to recognize um, the greatness of other achievements, especially with the Europeanization of the world that you described in the last 400, 500 years.
Well, I think the important thing is always to keep track of the humanity of persons.
Hmm.
And that means, as thinkers, we have to historicize.
Hmm.
And when you historicize, you contextualize. And when you contextualize, you humanize. And by humanize, what I mean is keep track of the distinctive individuality of persons, no matter what culture, no matter what society, no matter
Hmm.
what nation.
Hmm.
And when you do that, I think we're in a much better space. At least we have the right kind of humble spirit, fallible spirit to delve into the best of the West. Now, the
Hmm.
irony is that that is the best of the West. The intellectual humility, the intellectual fallibility, the intellectual self-criticism, the willingness to be not just self-examining, but also self-surrendering to something bigger than you. Now, we also know you find this in every culture and civilization, but because the West has been associated with the empires, the powers that shape and reshape the world, that it has a high visibility. I
Hmm.
mean, the Jesus, for example, that I'm deeply connected to, is not a Western product because Jesus predates the West.
Hmm.
But the Christianity that I encountered was a highly westernized form of Christianity. It
Hmm.
was appropriated by New World Africans, no doubt about that. But it was a deeply westernized and Europeanized version of it. And there were some wonderful things in it, and there were some ugly things in it. And I think when I think of Baal Shem Tov, I mean,
Hmm.
in the Jewish tradition, overflowing with love, full of compassion, almost an enactment of a Chekhovian play before Chekhov's father was born, right? That overjoyed by overloving. I mean,
Hmm.
it's a beautiful. Reminds you of Saint Francis of Assisi within the Christian tradition. And
Hmm.
I actually had people like that in my church, Shiloh Baptist Church, on the chocolate side of Sacramento.
Hmm.
See, those kinds of figures are ones that touch us at a very deep human level. Now we can find it in Islam. You can find it in Buddhism. Uganda, you can find it in Hinduism. You can find it in traditional African religions and indigenous peoples' religious practices. Absolutely, you can find it. We find a whole lot of things there, but we have to have an openness, and we can't come in with an arrogance or condescension. You can't come in with a uh, 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 just an ugly
Mm,
putting down
mm,
of others. That's the thing about it. There's a wonderful essay by Perry Anderson in the recent issue of New Left Review called on States of Civilization, where he
mm,
goes into a genealogy, a history of the term itself and the various ways in which it's been deployed over time. And as you can imagine, its dominant forms, justifications of empire, justification of European cultures, in its critical Socratic prophetic forms, understanding that human practices across the board are
mm.
ways in which we generate these structures of feeling and structures of value. It doesn't mean we can't still make value judgments. Uh, I think that's very, very important. That Hitler is a product of the West, and he's a gangster. He's a thug.
Mm.
Martin Luther King Jr. is a product of the West, and he's much, much, much less a gangster and a thug. He's still got faults and foibles,
That's putting it mildly, I would say.
but absolutely, he's just much, 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 much less. We had to be able to draw these distinctions, even though we recognize that history is something that is forever going on. And in the end, Hegel said history is a slaughterhouse, and Edwin Gibbon said history is little more than the register of crimes and follies of
Mm,
humankind.
mm,
That's an honesty about just how dim and dark things often seem to be.
mm, mm. In the spirit of honesty, I want to ask you about the teaching of courses labeled Western civilization or so-called great books. But I want to ask you, what do you think are the best arguments against teaching those courses? But what do you think is the best argument for teaching those courses? So I'd like to hear both sides actually, and maybe especially what you think is the argument against.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so much has to do with how it's taught.
Hmm.
It really is. And you know, masterful teacher, our conversation that we've had on the great Milton, of course, Milton's revolutionary figure, so that
Deeply prophetic figure.
deeply prophetic and supporting the regicide, writing major defenses of killing the king and so forth, that he fits right into a highly quote unquote progressive
Hmm.
politics. But of course, his understanding of who he is so deeply traditional
Mm-hmm.
and so deeply tied to classical and canonical texts. And he's probably one of the most well read poets in the history of the West. I mean, Thomas Gray and others would give him
Yeah. Yeah.
a
Thomas
run
Gray's
for
up
his
there
money.
too.
Thomas
Yeah.
Gray would give him a run for his money. You know what I mean? But so in that sense, Milton has got his foot in the so-called conservative camp because he has such a profound respect for tradition and the towering figures who came before him. But then on the other hand, especially these days where people want to know what your politics are before they know what color your grandmama is, it's like, oh my God, please can I say something about mom and grandma before I tell you what my politics are. So Milton's a fascinating figure in that regard. I mean, T.S. Eliot's almost the opposite. He's
Yeah.
got the right wing politics, but he's got the literary avant-garde
Mm.
that he embraces.
Mm.
So that I would argue is how the class is taught.
Mm.
I mean, I've taught those courses on many occasions. There was one semester I taught a course on Introduction to European Studies and Introduction to Afro-American Studies the same semester. One began with Plato, the other began with Du Bois. And how it's taught is, well, what does it really mean to be human? And how do we understand the conceptions of what it is to be human by these particular figures under these historical conditions?
Mm.
And they do it in such a powerful, subtle, sophisticated way that they cannot but bring you in. They are dramatic thinkers. They give us a sense of what it is to wrestle with conflict and contestation and growth and development. And most importantly, as Shakespeare would say, ripeness is all with maturation. How do we learn how to become more mature human beings, more courageous, more loving, more wise, and so forth? Uh, uh, I think when you couch it in that way, it can be very exciting, because people associate those classes with, what folk used to call in the old days a pedantry, a
Mm,
dressed as dust
mm,
orientation.
mm,
But as long as they're vital, vibrant, full of energy, full of freshness, and acknowledging that it's going to be in some ways over our head. We're going to be overwhelmed by it. So you taught Milton. You were teaching, was it Goethe that you were teaching?
yeah, teaching Goethe right now.
You're teaching Faust, absolutely.
Mm.
Well, I mean, Faust is over everybody's head.
That's
You know,
true.
you know what I mean? And you come in and tell your students, look, we're going to have a great time, and we're going to deal with this restlessness. We're going to deal with the
Mm,
library. We're going to deal with the Mephistopheles and so
mm,
on. But it's just so much here.
mm.
You cannot but be overwhelmed.
I,
It's
be- I,
like
be- I believe when he finished part two, he said, this will keep him busy for a few centuries.
exactly,
And he
exactly,
was right.
and he was right. And this is true for all great texts in every civilization.
Mm,
The Bhagavad Gita and
mm,
the Book of Job. I mean, my
mm.
God, you could teach that
Oh,
one great work of world poetry
mm,
for the next 20 years and still not get to the depth of it. That's
mm,
just what it is to have that kind of
mm,
richness. And so
mm,
John Coltrane's Love Supreme, you could spend a whole year just on part one,
mm,
acknowledgement, because he's got so many different layers and registers that he's working with, not just musically, but philosophically and so on. And that's what
mm,
makes it fun. But on the other hand, it acknowledges our fallibleness too. And that's what you want in teaching.
mm,
You want to go in with this sense of now we're going to be what Melville called existential deep sea divers.
mm,
We're going
mm,
all the way down and we never really reach the bottom.
mm,
We just don't. And
mm, mm,
in some ways it's a beautiful thing, but it cannot but humble you.
mm. It certainly humbles me. And when I'm speaking with my students who are 18, 19, 20, 21, and obviously you've had a long career of teaching some of the best and brightest students we have, I do think that I don't have time to lead them to everything that I would like to lead them
Right.
to.
Right.
So I find myself wondering, what is it that you think is the most important thing for young folks to keep in mind when they begin their education? What should be in the back of their mind as one of the primary motivators that helps them organize their education?
Yes, yes, yes. Well, there's two levels of it, and it goes back to the Greeks here. You might remember in Plato's Timaeus, where he gives us his conception of how the world came into being.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about pathos. He talks about persuasion in the face of force.
Mm-hmm.
That most of human history is the history of force, coercion, domination,
Mm-hmm.
subjugation, organized greed, organized hatred.
Mm-hmm.
And here comes these very little fragile interruptions of pathos, of persuasion, of mustering the courage to think critically, to generate argument, story, narrative, some form of communication with each other as opposed to killing each other. And that's a major breakthrough. We know that. We've seen it throughout his. We can read Karl von Clausewitz's great work of 1832 on war that his wife published after he died. Right. I mean, that has been one of the most consistent and persistent phenomena in history of the species, war. And the Greeks, among others, said, well, there's got to be some alternative. There's got to be persuasion. It's got to be some Socratic space where we just stop and say, look, let's actually try to converse with one another, learn and listen from one another, and maybe push back force, push back war, push back coercion. And we haven't been that successful about it, but we've had some moments of interruption. Well, see, that's what education is. That's what the Greeks call paideia, Paidei. And that's at its deepest level what the legacy of the best of the West is, even though the worst of the West is some of the most devastating barbaric wars in the history of the species. And we have to be able to put both ideas in our mind at the same time, as F. Scott Fitzgerald says in his essay, The Crack Up, 1938 in Esquire. You remember that the critical intelligence had to be able to keep two ideas in your mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And that's for human beings, that's for artists, that's for thinkers, that's for anybody who's serious about pushing back force, pushing back war, even though, in the end, we tend not to be successful. The wars, the frauds, the force, the coercion, the violence does tend to go on. So you're telling students that, in a certain sense, these texts are great examples of pathos, of trying to persuade people to see differently and feel differently and push back the worst of human beings and hope that maybe some fragile moments of interruption, the poetic expression, a philosophical expression, of scientific reflection can be critical of the wars and the violence and keep track of the best of the humanity of each and every one of us, because what the wars are in part connected to the worst of what's inside of us. It's not just them on the other side. No, that's the Manichaean perspective that reproduces more war. But you got to check yourself, because all of us have the capacity to go to war. You think of Gaza, you think of Tel Aviv right now. Somebody says, well, God, they killed my baby, they killed my mother. Of course I'm thinking about killing somebody, because that's a human thing. So the question becomes, well, how then do we acknowledge that profound human resonance with violence and tribalism and protection of our loved ones? That's profoundly human. And yet it's also true that sooner or later we have to reach the point where we have some ceasing, some closure, some stoppage to say, let's somehow create some space of dialogue, diplomacy, conversation. So we can call them Socratic zones.
You're simultaneously being, I think, realistic, but also in a way optimistic. And it reminds me of one of the scriptures that gives me the most comfort about history, which is the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And so often, even in the history of the West, maybe especially in the history of the West, those voices that are lonely, crying in the wilderness, sometimes they end up in the long run being the voice that forms the cornerstone, that forms the foundation for who we are and what we want to be.
That's exactly right, though, brother. That's exactly right. It's just that we have to be relentless, endless, and perennial in our commitment to courage and compassion. The best message that we can convey to our students oftentimes is more in the example that we provide alongside the text that they read. That if they see, as they see in your class, if they see a brother who is in love with language, in love with Milton, in love with poetry, in love with Goethe, in love with various figures, they could be a Toni Morris or anybody else, but in love, and they say, he's mustered the courage to direct his love toward these texts that are part of this tradition. That in and of itself is a crucial part of education, even before you get to the text.
Well, thank you, Cornel. I want to be respectful of your time here, but I just want to let you know again, I'm so grateful for you coming on here and sharing your thoughts and wisdom with everybody. It means a lot.
No, but I just salute you, brother. But we're going to continue this conversation. There's a sense in which, the great moment in which Rabelais writes his letter to Erasmus, the piety, the acknowledgement of his debts to someone who has deeply shaped him. You are my mother and my father. I can't conceive of myself without you, because you gave me what? The courage to be a free thinker. And then Rabelais goes on to become probably the greatest early European literary figure that we know. And of course, Erasmus is the greatest public intellectual in the history
Hmm.
of modernity, which includes Europeanization and the Americanization of the world. And that doesn't mean we don't have, critiques of those figures, but anybody who has the courage and the willingness to learn will find great wisdom in Rabelais and Erasmus, that Dutchman Erasmus and that Frenchman Rabelais.
You're carrying the torch of that kind of deep, broad thinking on behalf of all of us.
Well, I appreciate that, though, brother. But we in it together. We in it together. But God bless you and your loved ones, man.
All right. Thanks, Cornel.
Stay strong, my brother.